Good afternoon, to start with. And now I'm probably the last of the romantics, so maybe this probably wasn't the best title we're going to choose for this afternoon. But just to say, to look out across the room here and see, so many friends and buddies and people we've worked with down the years is always a joy. But more to the point, to see so many people coming forward in the whole RE space is just really exciting. And I think over the last couple of years, we've been using this language of recovery, and what does it mean, and where does it come from? And is it just a nice notion, or is there something beyond that? So I'm going to walk through a few ideas, and feel free to hiss. There's fruit being distributed if you need to throw stuff as well. But let's just bounce through a few ideas. And I'm conscious that people have had a really nice lunch. It's a fantastic venue here. Staff have looked after us all very well. So this is one of these do not adjust your set moments, okay? So, although we're going to ask you to adjust your mindset maybe. So, sometimes recovery is about making a fresh start after a difficult experience. And I think it's not necessarily a coincidence that we're here at the Bonington Hotel. And sometimes it is about finding a new identity and going forward in a new way. And life can throw things at us occasionally that cause us to do that. Not necessarily things you would choose, not necessarily things you can undo, but can you revisit? Can you dust yourself off? Can you bounce back? And recovery is very much in that space. So I think this is a particularly well-chosen venue for this conversation. But when Vision for Change talked about recovery, people said, yeah, that's a nice idea, but what does life look like if you don't have recovery? And I think in Ireland, we know a lot about this. In 1950 in Ireland, there were 22,000 people living in then psychiatric hospitals. It was almost 1% of the population, because there was little or no expectation that people would recover. And even though people actually did recover, they sometimes found that they just simply couldn't get forward and get back to their lives outside of the mental health service. And I think one of the key programs in RE is about people rediscovering their life as they would wish it to be in a different context and moving forward in a much more constructive way. So the question is, where does this happen? And I suppose, I'm conscious this is an after-dinner slot, so we try and keep this visual, but not too far from here is St. Brendan's Hospital. And I noticed this piece of graffiti on it a couple of years ago, just on the wall before it became the DIT. And I think that The Cure actually was the band, not necessarily referring to what was going on behind the wall there. But there was an expectation that you could go in behind that wall for a number of weeks, perhaps a number of months, in some instances, a number of years, recover yourself and then restore and back to the community. And how difficult was that on different occasions? Sometimes the language is confused. Even in Vision for Change, the chapter on recovery is known as rehabilitation and recovery. And the question is, are they the same? Are they variants of the same thing? Are they building on the same theme? Or are they actually, close relations but quite different? And I think this photo from St. Mary's Hospital in Castlebar shows there are two routes. There's a continuing care route and there's a recovery team approach. And they're not quite the same place. And I think many people here in the room here have a really nuanced understanding of what that is, regardless whether you're coming from a service, self-experience perspective, a family member perspective, or indeed a professional perspective. So this nuance of new language, and as Catherine has said, the recovery framework document is here, and it actually acts like a Rosetta Stone. It kind of acts as a translation, depending which perspective you're bringing to that. There's a common language emerging, which is really, really welcome, and wasn't necessarily easy to find in the first place. So is it rehab or recovery? The question is, do we actually talk about recovery? Many, many people in Ireland have used mental health services, have had a very successful outcome, have gone back to family, gone back to community, back to college, back to work, and they don't talk about it anymore. So sometimes I think it's almost like recovery is where stigma lives, as opposed to mental health issues. So is recovery simply about survival and putting on that kind of woolly hat that looks like a helmet? But sometimes the visor slips down and we just don't talk about this anymore. So many people who've had very, very difficult experiences, extraordinary traumas, and have managed to regather and galvanize themselves and come forward again, tend not to talk about that. There's that small gap in their CV that they somehow airbrush away in some way. And there's extraordinary learning, there's extraordinary hope in there. And that's why people with lived experience have so much to contribute to this conversation, and why family members have so much to contribute. And we're really missing huge swathes of our understanding unless we can tap into that knowledge and that expertise. So I'd say it's a really critical component if we want to make major progress in this space. I was just looking at my diary recently, and the 1st of March is looming. And on the 1st of March this year, I'll be marking my 35 years as a mental health professional. And it's been a long time, but I remember when I started my career, Lucozade came with a cellophane wrapper on it. I'm not quite sure what that was about. But Lucozade was a convalescent drink. If you were sick, if there was somebody sick in the house, you went to visit someone in hospital, you brought some grapes or some Lucozade. And this was supposed to restore them and rebuild them, but it was very much about convalescence. In the late 1970s, they began to change the language a wee bit. And they talked about how Lucozade was to aid recovery. Now, about 1981, they pulled this slogan because it was considered to be false advertising. It was suggesting that you could cure AIDS with Lucozade. So it had to move away from that. But today, when we think about Lucozade, we think of it as a sports recovery, isotonic energy drink, and associated with high performance, so being out there, being really energized. And I think in the mental health space, we're having a Lucozade moment. We're moving away from convalescence and care and minding and all of that into a space about being re-energized, refocused, and what was previously a breakdown becomes a breakthrough. And that's not in any way to minimize the complexity of mental health issues, but it is a much more hopeful script, one that we want to grasp. But the question is this always good news? Does everybody actually welcome recovery? And there are certain terms that we use in English that have kind of positive constructs around them always. So stuff like motherhood and apple pie and freedom and health, wellness, decision-making, responsibility. These are all things that we'd all wish for ourselves and for our family members and people around us. But sometimes the liberating effect of that can be quite frightening. Sometimes that can be a scary step to take. Sometimes we can get very subtle cues, or even less subtle cues, that discourage us from stepping over that threshold. And some people actually do rue the liberation. They don't look forward to this. This is too frightening. And for lots of reasons, their confidence fails, or their sense of hope just isn't sufficient to make that step. And that's why this collective movement, where everybody's working together, bringing all the perspectives together, but it's not a solo journey. It's always one that happens in a collective way if we're to be successful. So I think we just need to be a little bit patient with people who aren't quite there yet, and keep that hope alive, but be patient with people who aren't quite ready to make that major step just yet. The question then is recovery an exceptional phenomenon? Is this something that is very rare indeed? So at the weekend last week, I was over visiting my son. Actually, there's another piece of this slide we have to go with. Yeah. So is the idea of recovery good news for everybody? My son is an engineer, and we were out recently, and a guy went cycling past on one of these horizontal bikes or lateral bikes, and I said, wow, that looks like a really good idea. He says, is that a better bicycle than the one we're used to seeing? And he said, if it was a better bike, well, then all bikes would be this way. Over time, people would evolve and realize, actually, it's much more comfortable this way, it's more aerodynamic this way, you can get better, you name it. And the question is it unusual? So this is what we call the Tom Jones factor. And is recovery a rare event? Is this something that only happens once in a blue moon? Is it just someone who happened to get lucky, someone who had to have particularly good interventions, good supports, good resilience, good genes, whatever else happened to get lucky? But is recovery a very rare find? And certainly in my work, I think I've discovered more and more people, when you get to know them a little bit better, they will actually open up and share saying, yeah, I actually had a major difficulty at a key moment in my life. Whether it was in childhood, early adolescence, mid-adolescence, stepping into adulthood, or later in life as well. But they found a way through. But socially, they weren't always encouraged to share that story in a wider way. And I think we're now becoming much more mature, and certainly young people in Ireland are having a much more mature conversation about mental health issues and recovery, which I'm really excited about. I think we're going to hear a lot more of that. But we know that many of the structures, and sometimes very traditional structures, discouraged people from stepping back into the mainstream. As in the States, and I came across this road sign that says, don't drive in the breakdown lane. And again, it can take quite a degree of courage. We're not talking that you should just abandon all service or anything like that, but it's about saying, how do I develop interests and a life beyond the mental health service? Because we know that sometimes the mental health service can have an extraordinary gravitational effect on your life, and it can be difficult to escape that, to develop other interests, be that in sport or art or music or whatever it might be, but an interest that doesn't evolve and revolve around mental health care or mental health needs. So it is about creating new opportunities, and certainly our organisation and a number of NGOs working in Ireland are very much into that space, about building new community connections to have a real life outside of the services. So recovery is about recognising that we're all individual and we all have our own uniqueness and we move at our own pace. This was a Where's Wally event. I think Dublin holds the world record for this. So you may not recognise yourself in this one. I think you're the one in the tassel hat with the red and white stripes. But recovery is often, and has to begin as an individual journey, but it is being part of a movement. And it's not just going solo, but there is that singular conversation that says, today is the day that it's going to be different. Today I'm going to write a new script. Today I'm going to do something that's a little bit different. And, the question is there one for everyone in the audience? Will everybody experience recovery? Because if we're for equity, if we're for openness, if we're for genuine engagement and authenticity, we do recognize that there are people that recovery is going to take a long while. It's going to take very small incremental steps of getting there. If you ever get an opportunity to see the Canadian astronaut, Chris Hadfield, he described in July 1969, he was about 7 or 8 years of age, he watched the moon landing. And his whole family were gathered around a TV set watching this, flickery pictures and everything else. And he announced he was going to be an astronaut. And his family broke up laughing, thought this was hilarious. And he said, how do I get to be an astronaut? And there was no course that he could do. His local college didn't have astronaut for beginners. So he said, how do I get to be this person? So he said, well, I'm going to study engineering. And then I'm going to learn how to fly a small plane. And then he's going to learn how to fly a bigger plane. Then he became a jet fighter pilot. Then he became a test pilot. Then he learned Russian. And he basically did all of the things that were within his power to get closer to his objective. He knew he wasn't going to get there in one step, but he took small incremental steps towards becoming an astronaut, and he succeeded in that. He was describing, he says, it's very easy to find a good test pilot. He says, all the bad ones are dead. So he basically took all of the steps that would get him closer and closer to becoming an astronaut, and he achieved his goal. And I think when we think about recovery, will people get to this complete stage of recovery that they absolutely feel they've hit a conclusion and they're actually arrived at their destination, or are they on that journey? And I generally try and avoid the J word, but I think journey is appropriate sometimes. Programs like the RE program and a range of other initiatives, engagement programs, and you can see all the various posters available at the back, are encouraging people to reach out in their moment when they are ready. And as I said earlier, we do need to be patient. Not everyone's ready right now today, but when they are ready, that there are paths and guidance and routes and rails that you can follow along to get there. I think everybody here in the room, and you hear this from the workshops earlier, there's a really common sense of purpose. This is where the future is. This is where we want to be. This is what we signed up for in the first instance when we became professionals, when we recognized an issue in ourselves or within a family member. This is what we want. We want this together. And we will meet bumps in the road and we will meet obstacles. But when we collaborate, we'll get there. And that really has to be the take-home message. Is recovery an individual sport? I think the language is beginning to move now into a kind of a pooled effort. And we talk about not just my recovery, but our recovery. And when you have stumbled upon or discovered new strategies, there's really an obligation to share that insight. Recovery is like a currency. A currency itself has no actual value. It's only when you try to exchange it that you can extract its value. So when you have discovered something that you found really helpful, really useful, pool that. That's what's happening in the whole RE movement. It's about people saying, I found this helpful. I'm not suggesting you must do this, but you might want to add that into your utility belt of coping skills or strategies for going forward. That is a really powerful piece. I was in the States last year and I saw this sign on a homeless shelter, and it basically said, none of us are home until all of us are at home. So it is about making sure that we're patient and waiting for people who are coming behind us, but it is also about finding pathways. And I think through ARI and a range of other initiatives, we really have an opportunity to do that. Sometimes people use mental health services, get a kind of a passive sense that I'm being fixed. And they're kind of waiting for either some great new technology, some new medication, some expert intervention that's going to happen upon them. And next Thursday week, something magically is going to happen. And it's very easy to believe that. Sometimes we're sold that message. I can't open my fridge in the morning without taking out a yogurt that's going to reduce my blood pressure, or butter that's going to raise my cholesterol, or whatever it might be. So we're being sold this message that there's an intervention coming from somewhere else. And people can often experience that as being fixed. And the question is, who am I being fixed for? Is this for my benefit, or the service's benefit, or society's benefit? What's this process about? And am I comfortable with this? And do I feel I'm in control of this? Or is it moving at a pace that's not necessarily a pace I chose for myself? Recovery, the individual determines, when I'm going to recover, how I'm going to recover, how far I'm going to recover, when I'm going to recover. And for professionals, we need to be respectful of that process, not force it along, and equally not step back and abandon the person saying, call me when you have your mind made up. It's about keeping that hope alive. So, is recovery just about symptom control and being discharged, moving back from the services? Is it about taking back charge of my own life, being the author of my own life, making decisions, having choice and voice, and taking responsibility that goes with that, and taking some risks along the way to achieve that? And this won't always be risk-free. I think we all acknowledge that. But it is about looking forward. And sometimes in our lives, we're less encouraged and less inclined to actually design ourselves. And in the context of acute mental health issues, that is one of those key windows, one of those key moments to refresh, to look again, and not like in a New Year's resolution type way, but in a fundamental way saying, who's the person I want to be? And how's that going to happen? I think it's disputed whether it was Oscar Wilde or Abraham Lincoln. He basically said, wherever you're going to be a good one. So here you have, tourists looking in behind the curtain discovered that the zebras are only painting up early in the morning and said, you weren't supposed to see this. And sometimes when people experience a mental health issue, boundaries break down, barriers break down, masks fall off. And it is a very vulnerable, exposed sensation as to be out there without your suit of armor, without your persona fully positioned, without having your makeup on. And there's a huge privilege to work with people at a time like that and to be respectful of those boundaries and to help them rebuild in a way that is more comfortable and more sustainable. If you take out any large medical notes, you can look back and you'll see little triangles every so often. And a triangle is medical notation for diagnosis or differential diagnosis. And I think sometimes it's about thinking outside of the triangle, because sometimes we take refuge in sticky labels that says bipolar, schizophrenia, eating disorder. And these are conceptual models. They don't describe anybody completely accurately, and they're sometimes a shorthand. And like any model, that's all it is. You can't actually use it. It's only help you to gain an understanding and to gain an insight, but it's only a two-dimensional model. It's not the real person. And sometimes individuals who use the service, family members or professionals, jump into that shorthand far too readily, and the person gets lost. So I think it's something, when we're in the recovery space, we need to be mindful of. It can be a complex dance in terms of people who dedicate huge amounts of their lives studying, reading up, doing research, building their professional skill set, or people indeed who use the services, or family members who support people. And there can be a dependence, an interdependence, and an independence that goes on here. And how do we make a way around that? And the question is, if we have a disability, does that mean we're now waiting for rescue in some passive way? I think in the Irish Health Service, mental health is leading the way here in terms of people saying, no, this is my life, and I'm going to set out a new course, a new route, and I'm going to determine how I use the service and how that operates. And I'm going to work with professionals in a constructive, creative way. And the whole essence of co-production. And it's not about passivity, and it's not about being rescued. It is about taking charge and taking back control in stepwise ways, and having the skills and the resilience and the capability to do that. These are really important points. So as we can see here today, and previously when we were in Sligo, you were looking at the Sligo slides there a few moments ago, or in Kilkenny previously as well, we can see that, through RE, this is a movement. Now, this image here is a bit funny, and you kind of just play with your eyes a little bit, especially if you look left and right across the screen. It appears to be moving, but it's not moving. And we just need to be mindful of this. Like, this is a really exciting path we're all embarking on. Nobody has the precise destination worked out just yet, but collectively, we work together. And we just need to be a little bit mindful of that sometimes you can get lost on a journey, sometimes you can head into a cul-de-sac at high speed, and sometimes you have to stop and back up a wee bit. That's part of an honest discussion, and that's what's really valuable and authentic about this process, because it's bringing all of the valid perspectives into play together in a movement that's coordinated. So it's almost like a murmuration of starlings. Nobody's actually in charge of this, except everybody's in charge of this, and that's really exciting. So as we mentioned earlier, is stigma actually about recovery? Because this is the conversation we don't have nearly often enough. But we meet more and more people, and sometimes they're very successful in business or in their lives, in their families, in education, in the media, wherever it might be, and they've found their way back, and they want to share that experience. And it's really important that that gets articulated in a confident way, not in a boastful way, not in a martyrdom way either, but it's about saying there is a way back, and there is a hopeful way forward. In this whole space, the importance of the peer, the person who hasn't just read about this or had a curiosity about it, but someone who has lived the experience and come out the far side and found solutions that work for them that might be useful to others, is a really, really important perspective. And I remember many years ago when we were introducing advocates into mental health services, a very capable director of nursing who was very cautious but a bit skeptical sent me a text late one Saturday night. It was about 10:30 on a Saturday night. He said, "Peer advocate, what do you mean peer? What exactly is this peer?" And it was late on Saturday night. I was probably feeling a little bit equally cynical, and I sent him back this reply. I said, "A peer is a member of the House of Lords, to stare intently, a support for a gate, to share a common experience, a point of embarkment, as in a PEIR or PIER, or a fellow traveller." So he kind of knew probably sending me a text late on Saturday night wasn't the best time to do that. But sometimes being a peer is all of these things. Sometimes it is a point that you start a journey on, where you climb aboard a ship and you go somewhere. And sometimes it is about recognizing that you need extra support that isn't always available to you. And sometimes it is about finding wise people to engage with. So peers have a really important perspective here, but it's not the only one, but it's a really important one. And this is why through RE, there's an opportunity to learn, to share, to gather, and to do some show and tell, or brag and steal, as is known around here. If you're going to introduce movement into a complex system, it's going to have a consequence. It's going to have a knock-on somewhere else. And sometimes that knock-on is an unwelcome one. So you can expect to meet some resistance, some caution, some barriers along the way. If you're not meeting barriers, you're probably not making any sense at all. Tom Savage, who's one of the people who set up Car Communications, described when he grew up on the Cooley Peninsula. And on a wet night, his dad would bring him out because some bullock had run through the fences and destroyed all the fences, and they needed to be put back into the ground. And he was probably 8 or 10 years of age, but he had to hold the stake while his father hit it with a sledgehammer. And he says it was wet, it was freezing cold, it was miserable. He was waiting for the sledgehammer to slip. And if his dad gave it one good scalp and it went into the ground, Tom initially was delighted, thought, this is great. That went in really easy. But he knew deep down if it went in easy, it'll come out easy. So if you find that everybody agrees with you, if they're nodding in vehement agreement with you, chances are they're not listening to you at all. When you meet a bit of resistance, you've got traction, you've got engagement, you've got relationship, and you're getting an honest conversation happening there. if it moves that smoothly and just like through a hot knife through butter, chances are you're not going to make any sustainable difference there. So resistance is useful, and if you're not finding resistance along the way, chances are people are being polite. Now, one of the things this conversation doesn't need is to descend into politeness, because that's not real. So, if you're finding it a little bit gritty, that's a good sign. It doesn't always feel like that at the time, but that is an important symptom of change. And if you're not getting that, chances are you basically may as well take off your sandals and shake them and move on to the next village. So the question is, whose responsibility is it to convert the non-believers, the people who have just pulled down the shutters, who've given up on this, who've decided this was a lovely idea 40 years ago, but actually all my experience says otherwise, and what you're purporting here is false hope in some way. I think it's all of our responsibilities, and it's also the responsibility of non-believers to recognize themselves as such, and to come forward and actually look at the evidence, look at the energy that's in the room here, look at the appetite for change, and be aware of that. And if you can't assist, step back. Some of my international colleagues describe how they know many people who work in mental health who've given up but haven't left. And they said, if you're going to give up, do the decent thing and step out of the way and allow the next generation to come forward. Even in science, they describe that progress in science happens one funeral at a time. Because sometimes the old wise heads cling on to the old idea. But certainly in my experience, I've found that some of our most mature staff, chronologically, are actually open to this in an encouraged way, because it refreshes the reason they joined up in the first instance, be that last year, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or even really old hounds 35 years ago. But we have a shared responsibility to face up to this. We also know in this process that recovery is not just for people who use services, and recovery is not just for family members, it's for all of us. And it can be quite difficult in a professional role where there's a lot of expectations and a ready written script and a public expectation and mental health legislation that determines how you should do stuff. But can we recover professionals as we go? And I think it's a really important piece. Physician, heal thyself. But in this context, there's a shared role here. And it's a really important piece, because you cannot continue to run on empty. Eventually you'll run dry. And as a professional, you need to refresh. In some professions, they have the benefit of a sabbatical. Every 7 years, you step back for a year. We don't have that here. And the question is, how do you stay fresh? And it's programs like this can re-energize. So, coming towards the end, is recovery simply about symptom relief? I don't have that overwhelming depression. I don't have that terror every time I look at the future. I don't have that sense of self-disgust or disappointment when I failed at something. I don't have that overwhelming sense I need to run out of here with paralyzing anxiety. I don't have to have that confusion of whether I should trust my instincts or not. Recovery is a lot more than that. And if it's to be meaningful as opposed to meaning empty, it's going to be all of the things we've just talked about. It's a very broad menu of options. But I think we are beginning to understand that this is not unusual. It's much more commonplace than we expect. It is available. It is achievable. It's actually within our reach, except you have to reach out for it. And I think we need to move away from this idea that recovery might be possible, and say, no, actually recovery is probable, much more likely than possible. Not just getting lucky. It's actually about making it happen and bringing that into the space. And that this should become the new norm. This is not a completely alien concept. This should be our basic expectation. When people come to use services, their ambition is to be well and to get back into their lives again. And is there one for all? I think movements like this certainly make that much more likely than it was before. And I think we do need to be a little bit alert that not everyone is quite ready to take into this step or to take all of those steps together. So I think it's something that we really need to be a little bit patient about. And we have a collective responsibility here to make sure that the public understand when people develop very significant mental health issues, there is a way back. And I think that's something that we need to be very alert to. I know we don't talk so much, nearly enough, about Obama anymore, but he had this idea in terms of saying, are we going to just wait for someone else to come along? Is there another generation going to fix this, and we just have to sit back? But that is a fairly hopeless picture. And in fairness, I suppose one of the key messages from the Obama era is about hope, but it's also about taking responsibility and being in charge of that change and making sure it happens, and making sure it happens the way you'd wish it to happen. They are really vital messages. I suppose I'm really pleased that my organisation, Mental Health Ireland, plays an active role. We were active in terms of the recovery framework, but also in terms of kind of bringing a pragmatic expression to what recovery looks like. So whether it's ARI, whether it's Mayo Recovery College, Gateway, Ors Fallon, and peer educators. We have opportunities, some of our staff working in the Midwest just began this week. We've interviews next week for National Forensic Mental Health Service as well. So it's about making a pragmatic step forward so that when we're talking about recovery, people can actually see what it looks like and it can happen. So to finish, if we ask ourselves, what's recovery? Is it a lottery? Is it luck of the draw? Is it, you might be the one? Is it about actually holding on to that dream and taking steps to actually build that, to make it happen, to create that for yourself? Or is it about freeing yourself in some way and saying, guys, I'm not going to carry this any further. This is an impediment in my life. I need to address it. I need to accommodate it. I need to move forward beyond it. That's what I would understand recovery to be. So we're asking the question, is recovery a romantic notion? Or, are we all going to live happily ever after like Walt Disney would suggest? That's a proposal I put to you this afternoon. Thank you.